He was told he would be playing a god. They handed him lines to memorize. A gleaming breastplate polished to shine in the sunlight. A wooden sword painted to look like bronze. The role sounded simple. Walk into the arena. Speak the lines. Act out the myth. What they did not tell him was how the myth ended. Because in every version of that story, the god dies. And in this arena, myths were not stories. They were instructions. Centuries later, archaeologists found something strange beneath the wooden floor of the Colosseum. It was pulled from a narrow drainage channel designed to carry blood away from the sand. A fragment of bone, scored with marks that did not match any known Roman weapon. Not a gladius, not a spear, not a dagger. The marks also did not match the teeth of any predator Rome kept in its arenas. The forensic team wrote a brief note about it in a report. One line, a footnote. Then the investigation stopped. No one followed up. Now imagine the moment the gates opened. Light crashed into the corridor like a wall. Blinding sunlight after hours in darkness. With the light came the smell. Old blood baked into sand after a full day of heat. Iron and dust. Somewhere behind a second gate, something heavy moved. A handler stepped back. He avoided eye contact. What waited on the other side of that gate was not a performance. It was not a duel. It was not even what Romans normally called an execution. Rome had a word for what happened next, but the Romans themselves stopped using that word within a single generation, because some spectacles were designed to happen once and never be written down again. If recorded history still matters to you, stay close, because to understand what this man walked into and why 50,000 people laughed instead of looking away, we have to go back. Not to the beginning of the games, but to the lie that started them. The version taught in textbooks begins in 264 BC, a funeral, in a cattle market called the Forum Boarium. The place smelled of smoke, manure, and livestock. There were no stone seats, no stage, no grand architecture. At the funeral of a Roman noble named Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever, his sons organized a strange ritual. 3 pairs of slaves were armed with weapons and ordered to fight. The rule was simple. Each pair would fight until one man stopped breathing. The Romans called this ritual munus, a duty owed to the dead. Historians say Rome borrowed the tradition from the Campanians and the Samnites. Like everything Rome encountered, it absorbed the practice and made it Roman. From there, the story usually unfolds neatly. Grief became tradition. Tradition became spectacle. Spectacle became state policy. By the time the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, death had become Rome's most reliable form of public entertainment. It sounds clean, logical, easy to explain, and that is exactly the problem. Because in Roman history, the cleaner the story sounds, the more likely it has been edited. Livy records that the funeral games of 264 BC drew a crowd far larger than any private ceremony should have attracted. Thousands of people showed up. But the Forum Boarium was a cattle market. It had no seating for spectators, no platforms, no stands, nothing that could accommodate that many people. So how did thousands arrive prepared to watch, unless they already knew what was going to happen? Unless blood had already been spilled for audiences in Rome before? And this was simply the first time anyone decided to write it down. There is another detail historians rarely mention: the Brutus family archives. Documents describing the funeral were among the earliest Roman records later historians edited. Dates shifted, names quietly removed. Small adjustments that would seem meaningless to casual readers, unless someone was controlling the narrative before history had even finished unfolding. Most people stop paying attention at this point, which is why history keeps lying. Because the real problem with the story is not the dates. The problem is the motive. The textbook explanation says Rome stumbled into arena violence. But what if Rome never stumbled at all? By the 3rd century BC, the Roman Senate faced a crisis it could not solve with armies. Rome was growing too fast. Veterans returned from war expecting farmland that did not exist. Urban populations swelled inside fragile apartment buildings that collapsed so often the city maintained permanent rubble-clearing crews. Crowds of unemployed citizens filled the streets, angry, hungry, idle. The Senate needed a solution: not food, not land, control. And blood spectacles were perfect for that purpose. The Ludi Romani, religious festivals held for Jupiter, were quietly modified. Gladiators were added to the program, not because citizens demanded them, because the Senate needed a ritual that made obedience feel voluntary. Inside the arena, men fought wearing the armor of Rome's defeated enemies. The Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with his curved blade. Each fighter represented a nation Rome had conquered. Every time one fell, the crowd was not just watching a death. They were rehearsing Rome's dominance over the world. The arena was a political message disguised as entertainment, a loyalty oath performed in blood. Now imagine what the day looked like from the stands. You arrive at dawn. The air is cool. Vendors weave through the crowd selling olives and watered wine. Children run between the stone rows. From above it feels like a festival. But beneath your feet, 15 feet below the sand, a man in painted armor is learning the truth. The animals have not been trained. The wooden sword will not be replaced. The second act he was promised does not exist. And above him, 50,000 citizens are laughing, because they believe they are witnessing a patriotic ritual, not cruelty, participation. This was not a society losing control. This was a society functioning exactly as it had been designed. When Emperor Titus opened the Colosseum in 80 AD, Rome celebrated for 100 days. The festival was not a single event. It was an industrial operation disguised as entertainment. Ancient writers claim that during those 100 days, more than 9,000 animals were killed inside the arena. Historians repeat that number without hesitation. But almost nobody stops to ask how such a number was even possible. The Colosseum's underground complex, the Hypogeum, could hold roughly 200 animals at a time. 9,000 animals across 100 days meant something else entirely. It meant supply chains. Ships arriving before dawn with cages stacked on deck. Caravans crossing deserts with beasts dragged from forests hundreds of miles away. Hunters capturing animals that had never seen a human settlement before. Lions from North Africa. Leopards from the Middle East. Hippos dragged from the Nile. Bears from the mountains of Europe. Rome was not simply staging spectacles. Rome was emptying ecosystems. Pliny the Elder wrote that certain animals once common in parts of the empire had begun disappearing entirely. He described it as a curiosity. Modern scientists would recognize the pattern immediately. It was ecological collapse, driven by a single consumer, the arena. Every year, animals became harder to find. Every year, the cost of obtaining them increased. And that scarcity was not a problem. It was profitable. Because the rarer the animals became, the more prestigious it was to display them. Wealthy elites competed with each other to stage the most extravagant hunts. The extinction of entire species became a status symbol. But animals were only the most visible part of the system. The same supply networks transporting lions and elephants were also moving something else. People. Prisoners captured in distant wars. Condemned criminals. Political enemies. Slaves. Thousands of human beings catalogued, transported, and stored, with the same logistical precision as the animals they would eventually face. And what happened to them underground is something Rome tried very hard to keep out of written history. Because the gladiatorial system was not chaos, it was a business. Across the empire, specialized training schools called ludi produced professional fighters. The most famous was the Ludus Magnus in Rome. It sat only a short distance from the Colosseum itself. A tunnel connected the two structures underground. Inside these schools, gladiators lived under strict regimens. They followed carefully designed diets rich in barley and beans. They trained daily with instructors who had often been champions themselves. Roman physicians studied their injuries. Surgical techniques were developed in gladiator barracks decades before they appeared in civilian medicine. Archaeological evidence from gladiator cemeteries shows signs of advanced bone repair and cranial surgery. Rome invested enormous resources into keeping these men alive, not because it cared about them, because they were valuable. A trained gladiator represented years of investment. Purchasing him, feeding him, housing him, training him. By some estimates, an experienced gladiator could be worth more than a comfortable Roman house. And like any valuable asset, he had to be maintained. Healthy, strong, ready. Not to live, but to die well when his number was called. A dramatic death was good business. But not everyone in the arena received that level of investment. The system also created another category, a disposable class. They were called the noxi, the condemned. Unlike professional gladiators, they received no training, no real armor, no chance of survival. They were prisoners, deserters, captured rebels, people who had simply been on the wrong side of a Roman war. They were given wooden shields, blunted swords, and placed in the arena against trained fighters or starving animals. Their purpose was never victory. Their purpose was contrast. Their fear made the courage of gladiators look heroic. Their helplessness turned the crowd's cheers into something that felt deserved. They were not fighters. They were props. Human scenery built directly into the architecture of the spectacle, just like the trapdoors hidden beneath the sand. And sometimes the system created something even stranger. Female gladiators, the gladiatrices. Roman writers mentioned them rarely, and when they did, they treated them as jokes. The poet Juvenal mocked them. Historians described them with contempt. Emperor Domitian once staged fights between women and dwarfs purely for spectacle. According to the written record, these fighters were nothing more than absurd novelties. But archaeology tells a different story. In London, archaeologists discovered a burial believed to belong to a female gladiator. The grave contained objects associated with professional fighters. In Turkey, An alabaster relief depicts two women, Amazon and Achillea, standing face to face in full gladiatorial armor. Not costumes, professional equipment. The inscription beneath them declares the match a draw, meaning they fought as equals. The literary sources ridicule female fighters. The archaeological evidence suggests they were far more common than anyone admitted. Somewhere between the written record and the physical evidence, someone was lying. And when you find that gap in Roman history, the place where words and artifacts disagree, you have usually found the truth Rome tried hardest to hide. Because everything you have heard so far is the version Rome allowed to survive. What comes next is the part they tried to erase completely. The arena had a schedule. Morning belonged to animal hunts. Afternoon belonged to gladiators. But the middle of the day, when the heat drove many casual spectators away for lunch, was reserved for something else. Something historians mention briefly but rarely describe. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. And those midday executions were not filler. They were the most carefully designed spectacle of the entire day.